Hi everyone, I'm Maya, and today I'm going to be presenting on the Seveso disaster. By the end of the presentation, we will have investigated what caused the disaster, learned about dioxin and its health effects, discovered what occurred in the aftermath of the disaster, and explored what the town of Seveso is like now. First, we will discuss what caused the disaster. This is going to lead us into a discussion on dioxin, and we will dive into dioxin levels in Seveso as well as the effects on health. Finally, we're going to wrap up by discussing the cleanup and the legacy left behind by the disaster. On July 10, 1976, at the chemical plant ICMESA, a reactor overheated and exploded. This chemical plant made chemicals for pharmaceuticals and cosmetics. When the reactor exploded, a cloud of TCDD, also known as dioxin, was released into the air above Seveso that contained an estimated 15 to 30 kilograms of TCDD. Within a few hours, 37,000 people were exposed to this dangerous chemical, and almost immediately plants and animals were dying. Dioxins are a group of chemicals that include tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin, which is TCDD, and are formed as a byproduct of combustion. Dioxins are toxic chemicals that can cause health issues like cancer, reproductive, endocrine, and immune system problems. When dioxin is released into the atmosphere, it can attach to soil and dust as well as adipose tissue. Because of the long half-life of dioxins, they take a long time to break down both in the body and in the environment. When the chemical plant in Seveso exploded and released the cloud of dioxins, it took authorities almost a week to take action. The surrounding area was divided into zones by how much dioxin was found in the soil. Zone A was home to 736 people, Zone B, 4,737 people, Zone R, 31,800 people, and Zone non-ABR, 182,843 people. This map shows the location of the plant and the zones in proximity to the site. Families living in Zone A went into a 2-week evacuation and immediate medical care starting on July 26th, and they were already exposed for 16 days. They were not allowed to return to their homes, and they were later destroyed as part of the cleanup. People living in Zone B were not asked to evacuate their homes, but they were told not to consume any local produce or poultry. They were also given medical treatment, and then people in Zone R were only warned not to consume any produce or poultry. As I previously mentioned, the zones were divided by the levels of dioxin in the soil. Zone A was the closest zone to the site and had the highest concentration of dioxin in the soil. The soil becomes less concentrated as you move away from the site, which would be expected. The non-ABR zone had no detectable dioxin in the soil and was just used as a reference for researchers, so they had a group to compare to. Moving on to some health effects of dioxin exposure. Dioxin has a serious effect on human health, so one of the first things authorities did after the disaster was take blood samples from 30,000 people that were living in Seveso. This graph shows the dioxin levels in the blood 20 years post-disaster of the people who were living in the area at the time of disaster. People who lived in Zone A still had elevated levels of dioxin 20 years later, and we can see that the level of dioxin in the blood from Zone A to B dramatically falls. Acute exposure to dioxin can cause chloracne, which is shown on the left. Chloracne is the presence of cysts or nodules on the skin. Other skin lesions and some liver dysfunction can also be observed with acute exposure to dioxin. Chronic exposure to dioxin can lead to cancer and impaired function of many of the body's systems. Long-term exposure to dioxin can cause chronic health conditions, and the people of Seveso were followed closely by researchers to understand the dangers of dioxin. The cause of death for people residing in Seveso during the disaster were collected by researchers to understand if the dioxin was exacerbating deaths from chronic illnesses. Among all causes of death, deaths from respiratory cancer, lung cancer, digestive cancer, and ischemic heart disease were far more common in people who lived in Seveso during the accident. Research on the citizens of Seveso is still being conducted to understand the long-term effects of dioxin exposure in utero. In utero exposure has an association with the development of breast cancer, kidney diseases, and prostate diseases. Cleaning up the disaster took a lot of time and resources. Lawsuits against multiple chemical companies resulted in one company having to pay $168 million in damages. This was put towards decontamination, disposal of soil, and new housing. As I previously mentioned, cleanup also involved monitoring the health of the residents, including blood tests, dioxin treatment, and ensuring no contaminated food was eaten. In order to do this, authorities decided to slaughter nearly 80,000 animals in Seveso that likely had dioxin in their adipose tissue to keep people from eating them and getting sick. The Seveso disaster, while extremely tragic, taught researchers a lot about the effects of dioxin poisoning. It resulted in the creation of the Seveso Directive, which enforced a regulatory safety framework with the hopes of preventing future disasters. The ICMESA plant closed and was turned into the Seveso Oak Forest Park. Reminders of the disaster lie underneath the park where tanks of contaminated soil, animal parts, and parts from the chemical plant are held. And just to wrap up, the Seveso disaster occurred when an explosion at a chemical plant caused a large cloud of dioxin over the town of Seveso, Italy. Dioxin levels in soil and the blood of residents increased as proximity to the site increased, and this caused long-term health effects which are still being studied today. The Seveso disaster's legacy continues to this day with ongoing research to the people who were affected. I hope everybody enjoyed learning about it. Thanks for listening.